Hey everybody. So the past week, 2 weeks, I've been having conversations with people that deal with trauma. And honestly, this past week has kind of made me think about going back to school to get a master's in psychology. It has a little bit. But just because of all of the trauma, all of the talks about trauma, and I mean people online, people in my real life, people, just lots of talks about trauma, and different traumatic things that have happened to them and how we work through these things, right? We all have trauma. Everybody does. We all have different types of trauma. We all have trauma. We all have had traumatic things happen to us. I think that's just kind of the nature of what happens in this dimension, in this realm. Unfortunately, we are going to experience trauma. Thinking about this in terms of astrology, because that's what I do. Different places in the natal chart that you can look out for trauma and how to work through it. First, we'll start with Chiron. Chiron is the core wounding, right? That's what it is. And Chiron, okay, so I do think there's a difference between Chiron direct and Chiron retrograde. When Chiron is direct and has no ties to the nodal axis, I think the core wounding stems from this lifetime. If Chiron is retrograde, regardless of where it is in the chart, I think that the wounding tends to stem from some other lifetime that we bring into this one. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't wounded in this lifetime. I think that we are wounded in this lifetime too, but we bring that core wounding with us from a previous lifetime. That is my belief. That is how I tend to read it. Now, if you've got Chiron, say, direct, and it makes a square with the nodes or conjuncts the south node or something like that. Conjuncting the north node is a whole other story. But if it conjuncts the south node or squares the nodes, I tend to look at that as that's also a trauma from a previous lifetime. But that is like one's core wounding. So that is certainly one place that you would want to look out for trauma, obviously. Beyond Chiron, though. Okay, so you'd want to look at Saturn. Saturn is physical trauma. Now, when I say physical trauma, I don't mean trauma to your physical body necessarily, but I mean trauma in the physical world. Trauma in the physical world. And depending on the house that Saturn falls in, the sign it's in, any aspects that it makes, will give you a better idea as to how this plays out and where it plays out and how it dances with everything else. But this is one place that you'd want to look here for, like, physical trauma. Physical world rooted trauma, if you will. This is the only one of these planets that when it's retrograde, my mind automatically doesn't go to a past life thing, because it is a physical trauma, meaning I do feel like it's more physically rooted in this lifetime. That may not be universal, but my mind tends to stay there more than it goes to other lifetimes. Now, when you have, the next ones, I think the retrograde motion can point to previous lifetime trauma. Direct motion will deal more with this lifetime trauma. Not always, again, but that is kind of where my mind goes. So you have Uranus. Uranus is mental trauma or mental trauma. Again, if you're talking about Uranus direct, I would think that trauma is more from this lifetime. If you're talking about Uranus retrograde, I might think the trauma is more from a previous lifetime. My mind might go that way. Uranus is also soul memory. So it's where our soul memories are stored. So that's another reason why Uranus definitely makes me think of past life trauma. And I do feel like people that have Uranus retrograde might have more of a tie to that soul memory. I think it's possible that they do. It also means they might feel that trauma more. Any trauma that exists in the soul's memory, they might feel it more. I think that's possible. Again, you'd want to look at Uranus by sign, by house, or yeah, by sign and by house and by aspects to give you a better idea of how this all plays out for you. Neptune deals with spiritual or psychic trauma. If you feel like you have any trauma in those areas, Neptune is what you would want to look at. For sure. By sign, by house, by aspects made. I do tend to think that Neptune retrograde tends to point towards spiritual or psychic trauma from a previous lifetime or from some other lifetime, whether or not, and mind you, when I say previous lifetimes, it might not be one that's connected with this one, directly connected with this one. I mean, they're all connected in the big scheme of things, but it might not be directly connected in the way that like the nodal axis story and like there just might not be a direct connection, but it is there. So yeah, Neptune retrograde makes me think of a spiritual or psychic wounding that might stem from a previous lifetime, but comes up again in this one. Neptune direct makes me think of more spiritual or psychic wounding that stems from this lifetime. And Pluto tends to be emotional trauma, more emotionally rooted trauma. I would say the same thing about retrograde motion. Retrograde might make me think that stems from a previous lifetime, from some other previous lifetime. Direct makes me think more this lifetime. Emotional trauma. So if you feel like, and mind you, everybody, not everybody is going to have physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional trauma. One might be higher, one might be stronger than another. One of those might be more, might be greater than another. You might have trauma in all of those areas. I'm certainly not saying that there is always trauma in all of these areas, right? And with all of these different planets, because there very well might not be. But if you are somebody that feels like you have a lot of trauma that you need to work through, this is what I would look at and how I would kind of look at it. Like if you feel like you have a lot of spiritual trauma or psychic trauma, you need to be looking at Neptune. And what, you may not have trauma in all of these things, with all of these things. You may not. But you can definitely look at these planets from this lens, right? Shifting the lens and thinking about it in this way, strictly a trauma way, might not be a bad thing to do, especially if you feel like you have trauma that you need to work through. Some other places to look for trauma: 8th house, 12th house. 8th house is a whole lot of things, but it is like, I think of it as like the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. That's one of the ways that I think of the 8th house. So, and because it's not totally conscious, trauma can kind of hang out there. So I would definitely, other things the 8th house deals with, 8th house deals with bonding and deep and soul merging relationships. It can deal with sex and sexuality in that same kind of way. If you feel like you have any trauma with any of those things, definitely look at the 8th house in any of those areas of life. Now, because that house is more unconscious, somewhere between the conscious and the unconscious, the way that you make this stuff more conscious to you is by looking at where the planetary ruler of the sign on the house cusp falls, assuming that it's in a more conscious house. That may not always be the case. But like, I don't know, I'll give you an example from mine. My 8th house is in Cancer. The cusp of the 8th house is in Cancer. My moon in Capricorn is almost into the 2nd house, but it's in the 1st. And it's in the 1st house. So that brings all of that 8th house somewhere between the conscious and the unconscious. It brings it to my 1st house, making it more conscious to me, even though my Capricorn moon would prefer to ignore it all exists. But, that kind of thing. If the moon was in the 12th house, it might not be as conscious to me. I'd have to go a different way. put the moon in a house that's completely unconscious. So you do need to look and see where these planetary rulers fall, but a lot of times the planetary rulers of the house cusps can give you an idea as to how to make these things how to make these more unconscious houses more conscious, so that you can work through any trauma that hangs out there. Same thing with the 12th house. Now the 12th house is unconscious among a bunch of other things. So you'd want to look at what sign is on the cusp of the 12th house and where that planetary ruler falls, to give you an idea as to how to perhaps make that more conscious, so that you can work through that trauma. If there's any, if there may not be trauma in the 8th house for some people. There may not be trauma in the 12th house for some people. I'm not saying that there's always trauma in these places. There's not always. But these are just some places that I would look at for trauma, for working through trauma. Some places that I would look at first. So yeah, definitely look at that kind of, those places in the chart. That's kind of the first step, is knowing that, it exists and that you need to do something about it. Actually doing something about it is a whole other thing. I know I've got that problem. We all know trauma exists, but I really would rather not fucking deal with it. So, probably shouldn't be that way. But, yeah, anybody that wants to work through trauma in their own, through their natal chart, working with different natal placements and things like that, these are the places that I would look at first. Yeah, I'm going to get going. But if you want to follow us on Instagram, you can find us at Let's Fuck With Astrology. I'm at Saturn Season Astrology on Instagram. Natalie is at Abaturno Astrology on Instagram. If you want to like or subscribe or whatever the fuck people do with videos on YouTube, you can find us by searching for Let's Fuck With Astrology in the YouTube search bar. If you do the Reddit thing, come join us on the subreddit Let's Fuck With Astrology. And if you're interested in the star cards, go to letsfuckwithastrology.com/star-cards. Okay, y'all. I'll see y'all later.